Mr. Oswald, I'm curious about your personal background. If you could tell us something about where you came from, your education, and your career to date, we'd be interested.
I'll be very happy to. I was born in New Orleans in 1939. For a short length of time during my childhood, I lived in Texas and in New York. During my junior high school days, I attended Beauregard Junior High School. I attended that school for 2 years. Then I went to Warren Eastern High School, and I attended that school for over a year. Then my family and I moved to Texas, where we have many relatives, and I continued my schooling there. Then I entered the United States Marine Corps in 1956. I spent 3 years in the United States Marine Corps, starting out as a private, working my way up through the ranks to the position of buck sergeant. And I served honorably, having been discharged. Then I went back to work in Texas and have recently arrived in New Orleans with my family, with my wife and my child.
That's Lee Harvey Oswald speaking in August 1963, 3 months before the assassination of John F. Kennedy. He's being interviewed for a radio show in New Orleans, and he's just told 4 lies in the space of about 30 seconds. Oswald was never a sergeant in the Marines, buck or otherwise. He never rose above the rank of private first class. And although he was honourably discharged to begin with, the Navy downgraded that discharge from honourable to undesirable in 1959, after Oswald tried to renounce his American citizenship in Moscow. But those lies are trivial compared with the whoppers that Oswald tells here by withholding a couple of key facts. When he's giving the radio man the story of his life so far, Oswald somehow forgets to mention the part where he lived in the Soviet Union for 3 years. And when he says that he lived in Texas before coming to New Orleans, Oswald strangely fails to specify that the city he lived in was Dallas. Why would he be reluctant to mention that fact? Because 5 months before appearing on the radio, Oswald had tried to murder a man in Dallas. He'd taken a shot at the head of General Edwin Walker, and he'd missed it by about an inch. That crime was still unsolved, and Oswald wanted it to stay that way. That was the main reason why he'd moved from Dallas to New Orleans in the first place. Listen again as Oswald stops himself from saying the word Dallas.
Then I went back to work in Texas.
What other things might Oswald not be saying here? And why is he getting interviewed on the radio 5 months after trying to murder Walker and just 3 months before successfully murdering the President of the United States? In the previous episode of this podcast, we saw that the murder of John F. Kennedy is a he-done-it, not a who-done-it. In this episode and the next one, we're going to see if we can get to the bottom of why Oswald done it. Conspiracy theorists will tell you that Oswald had no motive to kill Kennedy, which means, according to the weird logic of conspiracism, that we're free to start pinning the murder on other people with better motives. The truth is that Oswald had quite a few motives to kill the president. Those motives were complicated, and they're hard to describe in a single word or sentence, but that, of course, doesn't mean that he didn't have any. The more we get to know Oswald in this episode, the more we're going to see that he provides us with all the answers we need in this case. To understand the why, we don't need to look beyond the who, we only need to take a closer look at him. My name is David Free, and this is The Ghosts of Dallas. Here's one of my favourite trivia questions about the Kennedy case. What movie was playing on the afternoon of the assassination when Oswald slipped into the Texas theatre at 1:30 p.m, 20 minutes after murdering Dallas police officer J.D. Tippit? The answer is that it was a 1961 B movie called War is Hell. It had been rolling for about 10 minutes when Oswald belatedly slipped into his seat. 20 minutes after he'd joined the action, the projector was shut down and the lights came up. A few minutes later, Oswald was hustled out through the lobby in handcuffs, loudly protesting his innocence. History doesn't record if he paused to read the tagline on the War is Hell poster that was hanging on the wall of the lobby, but if he did, he would have seen that the poster said, "There are some things that only the people that do them understand." Was that true in Oswald's case? Was he the only person who really understood what he'd just done? I don't think so. In fact, I suspect that the reverse might apply here. I suspect it might be easier for us to understand Oswald's motives from the outside than it was for him to understand them from the inside. To me, it seems quite likely that Oswald wouldn't have been able to give a complete and coherent explanation of his motives even if he'd wanted to. After all, what he'd done wasn't all that rational. So I suspect that in Oswald's case, we might need to tweak the movie's tagline a bit. I'd say that Oswald's crime was one of those things that only the people who don't do them can understand. Before we start burrowing into Oswald's motives, though, I want to step back and deal with a larger question that may have occurred to you during the previous episode of this podcast. You may have found yourself thinking at certain points during that episode, what is the big deal here? It's beyond obvious that Oswald murdered Kennedy, and it's fairly obvious that he did it alone, even if that can never be proved beyond doubt. So if this is such an open and shut case, why are we still going on about it now, 60 years after the event? Aren't we in danger of flogging a dead horse here? If questions like that did occur to you during the previous episode, I'm glad, because they're the right questions to ask. The question of who killed Kennedy really is no big deal as far as the evidence is concerned. Down at the factual level, this is the very definition of an open and shut case. Unfortunately, that's not the way it's seen out at the cultural level. At the cultural level, the facts about Kennedy's death have just never been allowed to settle into place the way historical facts normally do. That's why I'm going on about the case now. I'm going on about it because so many other people have gone on about it, and they've gone on about it so successfully that their paranoid fairy tales about the case have become more familiar to us than the facts are. One of the conspiracy theorists' spookiest achievements is the way that they've managed to erase Lee Harvey Oswald from his proper place at the centre of this story, so that these days you can hear long and apparently learned discussions about Kennedy's death, in which Oswald's name doesn't get mentioned even once. This campaign to make Oswald shrink and disappear from the pages of history goes back a very long way. Within a few years of the assassination, it was already starting to have an effect.
You know, they're shooting this for television. I'm sure that they'll edit this out.
That's David Crosby from The Byrds. It's the summer of 1967 and The Byrds are playing at the Monterey Pop Festival. And Crosby is cheesing off some of his bandmates by giving the crowd a long, rambling, impromptu lecture about the Kennedy assassination between songs.
I'm sure that they'll edit this out. I want to say it anyway, even though they will edit it out. When President Kennedy was killed, he was not killed by one man. He was shot from a number of different directions by different guns. The story has been suppressed. Witnesses have been killed. And this is your country, ladies and gentlemen.
When Crosby delivered this confident-sounding lecture in the summer of 1967, the first conspiratorial books about the Kennedy assassination had already been published, and they'd become major bestsellers. Those books hadn't quite succeeded in making Kennedy conspiracism respectable. Not yet. But many of the more lurid claims in them had caught on in the American counterculture, as David Crosby fairly pompously demonstrated at Monterey. Now let's jump forward to the 1970s.
Well, I'm telling you right straight out that if you are at all sensitive, if you're at all queasy, then don't watch this film. Just put on the late night movie because this is very heavy. It's the film shot by the Dallas dress manufacturer Abraham Zapruder, and it's the execution of President Kennedy.
That's Geraldo Rivera. He's hosting a talk show called Good Night America. It's March the 6th, 1975, and for the first time ever, Geraldo is about to broadcast the famous Zapruder film on American TV. Some of the film's less gory frames had previously been published as still photos in Life magazine, and bootleg copies of the complete 26-second film had been shown on American university campuses. But the broader American public had never seen the Zapruder film until Geraldo Rivera broadcast it on the night of March the 6th, 1975. As the film rolled, you could hear the studio audience gasp. After talking about the implications of the film with his guests, Geraldo turned to the camera and said,
Now, if you can remember back and be honest to when all these theories about conspiracies first came out in the mid-60s, then we treated the researchers and the people doing this investigation as kind of paranoid kooks. I mean, let's be honest, that's the way it was. But now we've all lived through the Pentagon Papers, Watergate, dirty tricks, and even the allegations, and I stress the point that they're only allegations, that the CIA and the FBI have engaged in illegal operations against American citizens. Well, because of all that, I think that most people are now more willing to listen to opposing points of view. I think one thing is certain. There are just too many loose ends. John Kennedy was murdered, and we at least owe him the duty of doing everything possible to find out who all was involved.
Nothing that Rivera says there is factually wrong. Between 1963 and 1975, lots of crazy and corrupt stuff really had happened in America. The Vietnam War, the Watergate hearings, the dirty tricks of the CIA and the FBI. If you didn't stop to think about it, you could find yourself believing that these things might have some sort of link to the Kennedy assassination. But if you did stop to think about it, they had nothing to do with Kennedy's murder unless they could somehow be firmly connected to the man who shot him, who was still Oswald. The evidence against Oswald hadn't grown any weaker between 1963 and 1975. The facts hadn't changed, but they were starting to be forgotten. People weren't stopping to think before they embraced far-fetched and unnecessary theories about JFK's murder. Back in episode 1 of the podcast, I said that the mystification of Kennedy's murder is the greatest con trick that American conspiracy theory has ever pulled. And the main technique that's been used to make that trick happen is the technique of misdirection. When conspiracy theorists talk about this case, they're constantly trying to direct your attention to peripheral, irrelevant things. Things that are not Oswald and have no proven link to him. Things like Watergate and Vietnam and the dirty tricks of the CIA. By 1975, this vast effort of misdirection was well on the way to succeeding. Oswald was already starting to blur and fade, and there was a growing sense that Kennedy's murder was this big, spooky mystery that had never really been solved. That sense deepened after Oliver Stone released the famous but fatuous JFK in 1991. A year after Stone's movie came out, Bill Clinton became the 42nd president of the US, and he appointed a guy named Webster Hubbell as his Associate Attorney General. Just before Hubbell started work, Clinton took him aside and said to him, "Webb, if I put you over there in justice, I want you to find the answer to 2 questions for me. 1, who killed JFK? And 2, are there UFOs?" That's a direct quote from Hubbell's autobiography, and as Hubbell adds, Clinton was dead serious when he said this. Back in the mid-1960s, Kennedy conspiracy theory had started off as a fringe activity. It was a hobby for paranoid kooks, as Geraldo Rivera put it. But by the early 1990s, the mass delusion had risen all the way up to the White House. The brain snatchers had got President Clinton too. Even he believed that JFK's murder was a question that had never really been answered. Now let's jump forward another 10 years to 2003, when CBS News marked the 40th anniversary of Kennedy's death by publishing a story on its website under the headline, 40 Years Later, Who Killed JFK? Saturday is the 40th anniversary of the death of President Kennedy, the story began, and the 40th birthday of the greatest whodunit in American history. So the he-done-it had now fully unsolved itself and turned back into a whodunit. The process of regression or mass amnesia was pretty much complete. To prove the point, CBS quoted a recent poll which said that only 10% of Americans now believed that Oswald had acted alone. Finally, let's jump forward another decade to 2013. It was now 50 years since Kennedy's death, and the filmmaker Errol Morris released a short documentary to mark the occasion. On the soundtrack of that film, Morris said, 50 years have transpired without anybody being able to get an answer to what happened there. In case you think you misheard that, I'm going to read that quote again. 50 years have transpired without anybody being able to get an answer to what happened there. This really is a staggering statement. It's on a par with saying that nobody has ever been able to work out who murdered Nicole Brown Simpson and Ron Goldman. Except, of course, that no respectable person would ever say that in public, whereas by 2013 it had become totally okay for an intellectual of Errol Morris's standing to say, quite casually, more or less in passing, that there had simply never been any answer to the question of who killed Kennedy. He was talking as if Oswald had never existed, as if he'd never been in play even as a possible answer. This is what 50 years of conspiracy theory had done. It hadn't delivered any remotely convincing answers of its own, but it had succeeded in making the old answer disappear. Under the steady drip, drip, drip of conspiracy theory, Oswald had been eroded and dissolved into thin air. So I don't think I'm imagining things when I say that conspiracy theory has distorted history in some remarkable and fairly sinister ways in this case. As the podcast goes on, I'll be doing my best to identify the various tricks that the conspiracy theorists have used to dismantle the established truth of Oswald's guilt. But before I show you how they went about erasing the man, I want to finish putting him back in the middle of the picture where he belongs. And I want to highlight how crazy and unacceptable it is to talk about this case as if Oswald was just never there. This brings us back to the question of Oswald's motivation. There are two reasons why it's important to understand why Oswald did what he did. For a start, it's an interesting question in its own right. If we can understand his motives, we can arrive at a deeper understanding of one of the most famous murders in modern history. But there's another reason why we need to talk sanely about motive in this case, because talking insanely about motive has been one of the key tactics in the misdirection campaign of the conspiracy theorists. Motive is always a big thing for conspiracy theorists. They think the key to decoding any major historical event is to ask yourself who benefited most from it. Motive is the ball that we should always keep our eyes on, according to the conspiracy theorists. It's certainly the ball that they want us to keep our eyes on when thinking about the Kennedy assassination. According to them, Oswald had no motive to kill Kennedy and didn't get any tangible benefit out of his death, which means, again according to them, that Oswald can't possibly be the true culprit. In the Errol Morris documentary that I just mentioned, there's an interview with the veteran conspiracy theorist Josiah Thompson, who says, quote, "What was different about November the 22nd and the tectonic shift that occurred there was that there was no why. Right from the beginning, we couldn't put a why answer on it. It seemed to be beyond that." The move that Thompson makes here is a kind of two-step knight's move that's extremely common in all conspiracy theories. First, he claims that you won't find any answers to the why question by looking at Oswald. And second, he implies, without quite saying it, that Oswald's failure to answer the why question provides us with a shortcut or a back door to a conspiratorial answer. Because if Oswald doesn't give us an answer to the why question, then at the very least he must have been helped by some person or agency who does give us an answer to the why question. From there, it's a short step to the conclusion that Oswald wasn't involved at all. In other words, when conspiracy theorists invite us to ask ourselves why, it's really just a fancy excuse to go looking for a different who. It's a kind of shell game. Keep your eye on the ball of motive for long enough, and you'll soon find that Oswald has magically disappeared from the table, and the conspiracy theorists can get on with doing what they've wanted to do all along, which is to pin the crime on somebody bigger and better than Oswald, somebody who conforms more closely to their expectations of what a presidential assassin should look like. As we're going to see, the first thing that's wrong with this shell game is that it simply isn't true to say that Oswald doesn't answer the why question. In fact, he had more motives than you can shake a stick at. But the second and larger thing that's wrong with this shell game is that it operates on the assumption that if Oswald didn't have a suitably large motive, he can't possibly have committed the crime. That assumption is worse than untrue. It's illogical. It's borderline insane. Reality just doesn't work like that. You find this quite often when you look under the hood of the various conspiracy theories about this case. They nearly always turn out to be fueled by pure magical thinking and by a kind of perverse determination to misunderstand the way the world really works. There's a scene in Oliver Stone's JFK where a shadowy government insider played by Donald Sutherland drops by to give Kevin Costner a supposedly profound lecture about the hidden truth behind Kennedy's assassination. Here's part of what he says. Quote, "That's the real question, isn't it? Why? The how and the who is just scenery for the public. Oswald, Ruby, Cuba, the Mafia. It keeps them guessing like some kind of parlor game, but it prevents them from asking the most important question. Why? Why was Kennedy killed? Who benefited? Who has the power to cover it up? Who?" That all sounds very wise and grown up when Donald Sutherland says it in the film, but when you stop to think about it, it's deeply juvenile stuff. What Sutherland effectively says is, let's not find Kennedy's killer by doing boringly old-fashioned things like identifying a crime scene and establishing who was physically present there. Begin your investigation at the edge of the story, not the centre. Sit back in your armchair and think about who had the most intriguing motive to kill Kennedy on paper, and bingo, you will have found your assassin. Think up a juicy enough answer to the why question, and the who question will be answered automatically. This is, of course, utter nonsense, and it's a recipe for putting innocent people on trial for crimes they didn't commit, which is exactly what Stone's hero Jim Garrison did in real life. Like many scenes in Stone's movie, this one illustrates a point that I really want to hammer in this podcast. Most conspiracy theorists are perfectly sane people, but to reach their preferred conclusions, they have to think in insane ways. They have to turn normal ways of thinking upside down and inside out. Any child can see that you can't solve a crime by just thinking about who had the best motive to commit it. Motive is a secondary question. No rational investigation of any crime should start with it. And that's even more true when you're talking about a presidential assassination. Kennedy was the most powerful man in the world. Obviously, lots of people and agencies had a theoretical motive to kill him, and equally obviously, they can't all have done it. That's why I spent 2 episodes of this podcast discussing the nuts and bolts of Oswald's guilt before I got to the question of motive, because it seems to me obvious that the only motives worth discussing here are the motives of the person we know committed the crime. It also seems to me obvious that although the motive question is important, it's not a deal breaker. In other words, even if we were to find that Oswald had no motive at all to kill Kennedy, and we're not going to find that, but even if we did, that wouldn't somehow magically change the physical evidence that proves beyond a shadow of a doubt that he shot him. Anyway, over the course of this episode and the next one, we're going to see that Oswald had motives coming out his ears. We're going to see that this idea that he doesn't answer the why question is simply bizarre. It's a suggestion that can be made only by people who have willfully blinded themselves to the facts. I think that what conspiracy theorists like Oliver Stone and Josiah Thompson really mean when they say that Oswald had no motive is that he had no motive that matches their preconceived ideas about what a presidential assassin's motive should be. He had no motive that can be summed up in a single sentence or preferably a single word. Greed, power, revenge. Conspiracy theorists think that if Oswald's motive can't be stated in the form of a soundbite, then he didn't do it. But again, that's not the way reality works. Yes, Oswald's motives can't be put into a soundbite, but that doesn't mean that he didn't have motives. It just means that he was a real human being as opposed to a cartoon character. Marina Oswald tried to make this point in 1978 when a member of the House Select Committee on Assassinations asked her for a quick soundbite answer to the question of why she thought Oswald did it.
The broadest question, I think, in the American public's mind is, was it a politically motivated act, or was it an intensely personal act that came out of some twisted personal psyche?
Well, it's a quite difficult question to answer. I really don't know what to say about the motive. If you want my personal opinion about, was it mental or political, I have to choose just the mental state of the person.
Marina is seriously reluctant to talk as if Oswald's political motives can be easily disentangled from his psychological ones. If she's forced to name just one motivating factor, she says that she would choose Oswald's disordered personality, the mental state of the person, as she puts it. But you can hear her resisting the idea that Oswald's motives can be summed up in a simple soundbite, even as the congressman keeps pressing her to do exactly that.
So that you would discount the political motivation as part of his motive. It could have been that he simply wanted to make himself important by killing someone important. Do you feel that this latter motivation was the most important part of his motivation?
Well, the whole matter is so irrational, and it's very hard for us to come up with any rational answers. But I would buy your statement that you made the last one about as long as somebody important, it probably doesn't matter what their political views are.
The whole matter is so irrational, it's very hard for us to even come up with any rational answers, Marina says there. That's an excellent way of putting it, especially when your first language isn't English. But since Marina is being pushed to give a soundbite answer, she again says that Oswald's motive was probably more psychological than political, and that he killed Kennedy mainly because of Kennedy's prominence rather than his policies. Or, as Marina puts it, I would buy your statement that you made, the last one, as long as it's somebody important, it doesn't matter what their political views are. I still think, though, that the money quote from Marina there is the cautionary statement that she made up front. The whole matter is so irrational, it's very hard for us to even come up with any rational answers. In other words, if we want to arrive at a genuine understanding of Oswald's motives, we need to resist the urge to simplify them. We need to learn to live with complexity. In fact, as we dig down into Oswald's psyche in this episode and the next one, we're going to encounter a strange kind of paradox. the more we get to know the man, the more blurry and mixed up his motives are going to seem. But I don't think we should be afraid of that paradox. I think we should take it as a sign that we're on the right track, a sign that we're getting to know a real human being who had many different things going on in his mind at the same time. After all, that's how our minds work, so why should we think that Oswald's mind worked any differently? Psychologists have a word for actions that are prompted by more than one motivating factor. They say that such actions are overdetermined. We need to respect that concept if we really want to get to the bottom of why Oswald shot Kennedy. The act was overdetermined. Partly Oswald's motive was political, and partly it was psychological, and partly it came from a place in him where those two things, his private resentments and his radical politics, were so tightly tangled together that it's impossible to separate them. Oswald's interest in radical politics began in 1953, when he was 13 years old. One day in the early months of that year, an old woman handed him a pamphlet on a New York street. I looked at that paper, and I still remember it for some reason. I don't know why, Oswald said years later. The pamphlet he was talking about concerned the case of Ethel and Julius Rosenberg. The Rosenbergs were a notorious husband and wife pair of convicted spies. Both of them were members of the US Communist Party, and in 1953 they'd been put on trial for having allegedly passed on military secrets to the Soviet Union. They were both found guilty, and they were sentenced to death by electric chair. In early 1953, when the young Lee Oswald was given that pamphlet about them, the Rosenbergs were sitting on death row, and they'd become the subject of a massive international campaign that was urging the US government to grant them clemency. The campaign didn't end up working, and the Rosenbergs went to the electric chair in June 1953. The author Jean Davidson, in her book Oswald's Game, suggests that the assassination of JFK can ultimately be traced back to that fateful moment in New York when the young Oswald was handed that pamphlet about the Rosenbergs. The Rosenberg case, writes Davidson, introduced Oswald to a belief system that, quote, gave his anger and resentment a direction. According to Davidson, Oswald's chance encounter with that New York pamphleteer was the first link in the chain of circumstance that led to Kennedy's assassination. It was the first episode in a, quote, steady accumulation of chance happenings that ultimately resulted in the president's death. I'm not sure that Davidson is right about that. In a way, it's arbitrary to say that the story of the assassination began at any particular moment, but I do think that she's dead right to suggest that from the time Oswald was 13 years old, it becomes artificial to speak as if his resentful personality and his radical politics were two separate things. When he became interested in the Rosenberg case, the two things fused. From that point on, Oswald's unsubtle extremist politics gave him a respectable, or at least semi-respectable, outlet for his raging sense of personal grievance, and indeed for his propensity to violence. Marxist politics would become the prism that he saw everything in his life through. Just a few months after the Rosenbergs were executed, Oswald was already getting into trouble at school for consistently refusing to salute the American flag. Martin Amis once wrote that Oswald's life was not a cry of pain so much as a squawk for attention. I think that's harsh but fair. The shooting of Kennedy was Oswald's final squawk for attention, and it had a spectacular effect. But to make sense of the squawk that was heard around the world, we need to grasp that Oswald had been squawking for attention his entire life, and had never received nearly as much of it as he thought he deserved. By the time he entered his late teens, Oswald was thoroughly convinced that he would one day be thought of as a great man, and the field he thought he would be a great man in was the field of radical politics. After he quit the Marines at the age of 19, pretty much every big decision Oswald made in his life sprang from a burning desire to make his mark as a left-wing man of action. In 1959, just 2 days before his 20th birthday, he arrived in Moscow on a tourist visa, and he made his famous attempt to defect to the Soviet Union. While he was waiting for the Soviet authorities to rule on his case, an American reporter named Aileen Mosby tracked Oswald down in his Moscow hotel room, and she talked him into granting her an interview. "I still remember that pamphlet about the Rosenbergs," Oswald told Mosby. "I don't know why. Then we moved to New Orleans," he went on, "and I discovered one book in the library, Das Kapital. It was what I'd been looking for. It was like a very religious man opening the Bible for the first time. I started to study Marxist economic theories. I could see the impoverishment of the masses before my own eyes in my own mother." When Aileen Mosby interviewed Oswald in room 233 of the Metropole Hotel in Moscow, he'd been waiting a month for the Supreme Soviet to rule on his citizenship application. Around 3 weeks earlier, that is, 1 week after arriving in Russia on his tourist visa, Oswald had committed his first documented act of political violence. The victim of it was Oswald himself. He had slashed his wrist in another Moscow hotel room in an apparent attempt to commit suicide, although the evidence firmly suggests that the attempt was staged. What had happened was this. Oswald had arrived in Moscow on October the 16th, travelling on a 6-day tourist visa. He'd been greeted on arrival by his official government in-tourist guide, whose name was Rima Shirokova. Just a few hours after meeting her, Oswald told Rima that he wanted to become a Soviet citizen. Rima was touched by this unusual show of enthusiasm for her totalitarian homeland, and she offered to help Oswald lay out his citizenship pitch in a letter to the Supreme Soviet written in Russian. "I want citizenship because I am a communist and working-class person," Oswald's letter said. "I have lived in a decadent capitalist society where the workers are slaves. I wish to reject my American citizenship and accept the responsibility of a Soviet citizen." Oswald humbly asked the Supreme Soviet to grant his request within the next 6 days before his tourist visa expired. When he hadn't heard back from them within a couple of days, Oswald upped the ante. He told Rima that if he did get citizenship, he would reward the Soviets by telling them all the American military secrets that he'd picked up in the Marines. Rima relayed this offer to her superiors, as Oswald had known she would. On the morning of October the 21st, the same day that his visa was due to expire, Oswald was formally interviewed by a man who introduced himself as an employee of the Passport and Visa Office. In reality, he was an officer of the KGB, and it didn't take him long to conclude that Oswald was young and disturbed and had zero information to offer the Soviets that they didn't know already. To Oswald's consternation, his application for citizenship was declined. The authorities bought him a one-way train ticket to Finland and told him to report back to the passport office in Moscow at 3 o'clock that afternoon. Oswald's dream of settling in Russia seemed to be dead in the water. At 2 that afternoon, Rima and her driver arrived at Oswald's hotel to take him to the station. Oswald was meant to meet Rima downstairs at 2 o'clock sharp, and until now he'd always impressed her as very punctual. When he still hadn't appeared by 2:30, Rima went up to his room. After knocking and getting no reply, she got a maid to open the door with a pass key. They found Oswald in the bathtub, bleeding from a wound in his wrist. He was rushed to hospital, where he received 5 stitches. In the hospital records, Oswald's wound is described as light. There's also a note which indicates that Oswald admitted to having staged the suicide attempt to, quote, postpone his departure from the USSR. When Norman Mailer went to Moscow in the early 90s to research his book Oswald's Tale, he tracked down the doctor who had treated Oswald in 1959. She recalled his case vividly. She said that his wound was not much more than a scratch, and certainly not deep enough to open a vein. Usually in such cases she was required to determine why the patient had attempted suicide, and whether there was any risk of a follow-up attempt. With him, the doctor told Mailer, you didn't really have to ask such questions because it was not really an attempt. So the evidence about Oswald's apparent suicide attempt in Moscow seems pretty clear. It was a tactical attempt rather than a genuine one. He had spilled blood in order to get his own way. In this case, the blood was his own, but there's no question that the exercise was a success. In fact, Oswald had achieved something that was extremely rare in that era. He had managed to get one over on the government of the Soviet Union. Given that he was now lying in a hospital bed in Moscow, the Soviets had no choice but to let him stay in the country beyond the expiry of his visa. He wound up staying in hospital for a week, including 3 days in the psych ward. When he was discharged, the government put him up in a different Moscow hotel, a cheaper and less tourist-friendly one, while they pondered what to do about him in the long term. Oswald had put them in a devilishly tricky position. If they tried to deport him and he actually did commit suicide, he would cause an international incident at a very delicate moment in the Cold War. As we heard back in episode 1 of the podcast, Oswald wound up staying in the Soviet Union for close to 3 years, and when he ultimately returned to the US, it wasn't because the Soviets had kicked him out. It was because Oswald himself was good and ready to leave. During his time in the USSR, he wrote something that he grandly called his historic diary. This so-called diary has survived, and you can read it online if you can make out Oswald's handwriting and if you can get past his famously abysmal spelling. It runs for a total of 12 pages, and it's a notoriously strange document. Although it contains a series of dated entries that purport to cover the whole period of his stay in the USSR, everyone who's studied it agrees that Oswald appears to have sat down just before his return to the US and written out the whole thing in 1 or 2 sittings, possibly using rough notes that he'd made at an earlier stage. We know this from handwriting analysis and because in some of the earlier entries Oswald makes reference to things that didn't really happen till much later on. He also makes provable mistakes about things like dates and times. For example, in the entry about his suicide attempt, he says that the attempt took place at 8 o'clock in the evening, but the hospital records tell us that Oswald was admitted at 4 p.m. that afternoon, and reliable witnesses, including Reamer, the in-tourist guide, said that Oswald was found in his bathtub at around 2:30 p.m. Oswald's historic diary is strewn with factual errors like that one. But at a deeper level, it's a reliable and useful document which gives us some startling insights into who Oswald was and how he saw himself. To give you an idea of the diary's flavour, I'll read you Oswald's account of his suicide attempt. I'll be quoting it verbatim, although some bits are so preposterous that they're going to sound as if I'm making them up. Quote, October the 21st, evening, 6 o'clock. Receive word I must leave country at 8 p.m. tonight as visa expires. I am shocked. My dreams. I retire to my room. I have $100 left. I have waited for 2 years to be accepted. My fondest dreams are shattered because of a petty official, because of bad planning. I planned too much. 7 p.m. I decide to end it. Soak wrist in cold water to numb the pain, then slash my left wrist, then plunge wrist into bathtub of hot water. I think when Reamer comes at 8 to find me dead, it will be a great shock. Somewhere a violin plays as I watch my life whirl away. I think to myself, how easy to die, and a sweet death to violins. About 8, Reamer finds me unconscious. Bathtub water a rich red colour. She screams, I remember that, and runs for help. As you listen to Oswald's riff about the distant violin, you see why the conspiracy theorists don't want it to be true that this was the man who succeeded in gunning down America's vibrant young president. If the course of history was changed by a posturing little clown like this, then the universe is clearly absurd. And conspiracy theorists can't stand that thought. They want to live in a world that makes sense. They need to believe that history is meant and that major events don't happen by accident. They need to believe the world is at least under somebody's control, even if the people controlling it are wicked beyond belief. Unfortunately for the conspiracy theorists, the facts tell us that Kennedy really was killed by the author of those laughable sentences about the distant violin. This man who spelt the word wrist, R-I-S-T, and the word plunge, P-L-A-U-G, this man really did go on to commit one of the most consequential crimes in human history. As we'll see later on in this episode, the historic diary wasn't the only sustained piece of writing that Oswald left behind him. In fact, for a semi-literate guy, he left behind a surprising amount of written stuff. You might think that Oswald's writings would be a valuable resource if we want to understand what motivated him and what generally went on in his head. But as that little excerpt from his historic diary demonstrates, Oswald's prose needs to be approached with caution. He was no writer, to put it mildly. He didn't use language to give a sincere account of what really went on in his mind. He probably couldn't have done that even if he'd wanted to, but the point is that he didn't want to. He used writing to dramatize and mythologize and vindicate himself, not to express his true thoughts. Somewhere a violin plays as I watch my life whirl away. That sentence is typical of Oswald. The language is as shallow and insincere as the staged suicide attempt that he's writing about. If we want to know the real Oswald, I think we're generally better off looking at his actions rather than his words. Oswald's older brother Robert once said something profound about the Kennedy assassination. He said, "To try to understand why Lee did what he did on November the 22nd is a cumulative effect of all his past plans and efforts and failures." Robert Oswald was one of the 2 or 3 people in the world who knew Lee the best, which meant that he was one of the first people in the world who understood why Kennedy had been murdered. To the world at large, Kennedy's murder came completely out of the blue, and it made no sense. And ever since, people have continued to make the mistake of thinking that the lone assassin story makes no sense because they haven't taken the trouble to find out who the lone assassin was. But if we follow the lead of Oswald's brother and think of Kennedy's murder as an event in Oswald's life, then it doesn't look inexplicable at all. We begin to see that it was the culmination of a long pattern of behaviour. His aggressive but unsuccessful attempt to defect, his fake suicide attempt, his intense but unsatisfactory love affair with the USSR. In retrospect, Oswald's life before Dallas looks like a long series of rehearsals or dry runs for what he eventually did there. Most of his early plans and efforts failed and made him resolve to try harder next time, but some of his early experiments with violence worked. They showed him that it was a good means of getting your own way, and you could get away with it without suffering serious punishment, and sometimes without suffering any punishment at all. I said a few minutes ago that the fake suicide bit in Moscow was Oswald's first major attempt to use violence to bend the course of events to his will, but it's possible that it wasn't. It's possible that he'd done something similar a couple of years before, although the evidence about this earlier episode has always been very sketchy. It happened 2 years before his attempted defection to Russia, when the 18-year-old Oswald suffered a mysterious gunshot wound while serving in the Marines. His unit was stationed in Tokyo at the time, and it was about to go on maneuvers in the Philippines. One afternoon or evening, a group of Oswald's fellow Marines heard a shot ring out in the barracks. They ran in, and they found Oswald sitting on his bunk, bleeding from a wound to his elbow or forearm. He claimed that he had dropped his service weapon, and it had accidentally gone off. But Oswald's service weapon was a .45, and his wound had been inflicted by a .22 caliber bullet. It soon became clear that this bullet had been fired from a 2-shot Derringer that Oswald had secretly mail-ordered from the US and kept stashed in his locker. Some of the men in his unit firmly believed that Oswald had shot himself deliberately in order to get out of having to go on maneuvers in the Philippines. If that was his plan, it didn't work. After a brief stay in a naval hospital, he was shipped to the Philippines, and when his unit returned to Tokyo, he was court-martialed for possession of an unauthorized firearm. The truth about the incident with the Derringer will almost certainly never be known for sure. The Moscow self-harm episode was more clear-cut, and it showed that Oswald was starting to get quite good at using violence to impose himself on the world. When he came out of hospital a week after that incident, he was again interviewed by a KGB man posing as an official from the passport office. Again, this guy confirmed what the KGB already knew. Oswald was a nobody, and he had no worthwhile intelligence to pass on. But by now the Soviets had decided that it would be unwise to expel him from the country. He was told he could remain in Moscow while the Supreme Soviet gave further thought to his case. If Oswald had been a more cautious person, he might have let things rest there for a while. But since he was Oswald, he waited just a couple of days before making yet another frantic attempt to bring his situation to a head. On October the 31st, he stormed into the American embassy in Moscow and tried to renounce his US citizenship on the spot. To avoid a mix-up here, I'd better point out that this episode in Moscow should not be confused with the time when Oswald stormed into the Cuban embassy in Mexico in 1963 and demanded to be let into Cuba on a transit visa. In his short life, Oswald did a lot of storming into embassies and demanding things, so we need to keep our embassy tantrums straight. Anyway, when he threw his 1959 tantrum in the American embassy in Moscow, the official who dealt with him was a guy named Richard Snyder. When Kennedy was assassinated 4 years later, Snyder still had clear memories of his encounter with Oswald in Moscow. He remembered thinking that Oswald was, quote, a flaky kid who didn't have the faintest idea of what the Soviet Union was really like. He had all the earmarks of a sophomore Marxist, Snyder said. He was like someone who'd just discovered a religion. He was wound up like 6 watch springs. You could tell, said Snyder, that he'd been rehearsing this scene for a long time. Snyder was an experienced diplomat. He could see that Oswald was a clueless hothead, and he wasn't about to let him dissolve his citizenship on a whim. So he told Oswald that these things took time, and that he'd have to come back another day to sign the appropriate documents. Naturally, Oswald wasn't too happy to hear that. I think he was dissatisfied, Snyder recalled. It was quite possible that this was to be his big moment on the stage of history as far as he was concerned. He may have contemplated this for some time, as he said, and thus my refusal at that time may have been a hurdle which he was totally unprepared for. Snyder would soon be vindicated, of course. Oswald got sick of the Soviet Union pretty fast, and he might have been stranded there forever if Snyder had let him dissolve his US citizenship when he'd wanted to. Instead, when the future Oswald decided that he desperately wanted out of the USSR, he was able to milk his rights as an American citizen for all they were worth. But in November 1959, returning to America was the last thing on Oswald's one-track mind. On the 27th of that month, the Central Committee of the Soviet Communist Party delivered an interim ruling on his case. They would let him stay in the Soviet Union for a year, and at some point during that period they would make a final decision about his residency and citizenship. In the meantime, they packed him off to live in the provincial city of Minsk. When told that he'd be living there instead of Moscow, Oswald cried. He had imagined himself studying philosophy and politics at university in Moscow. He thought that he might eventually be given a position in the party or even in the Soviet government. And now he'd been shunted off to Minsk, where he was given a job in a radio factory. Pretty soon after his arrival in Minsk, Oswald stopped actively campaigning to become a Soviet citizen. And after living there for about a year, he started peppering the US Embassy in Moscow with letters demanding guarantees that if he returned to America, he wouldn't be prosecuted for anything that he'd done while attempting to defect. The State Department let Oswald stew for about 15 months before giving him the assurances he wanted. Finally, in June 1962, he sailed back to the US with the wife and baby daughter that he'd had time to accrue while cooling his heels in Minsk. Oddly enough, Oswald's experiences in the USSR didn't turn him off communism altogether. They only turned him off Soviet communism. After returning to the US and settling in Dallas, Oswald came down with a new strain of left-wing fever. He turned his sights to Cuba and started pinning all his revolutionary hopes and dreams on the supposedly stainless socialist regime of Fidel Castro. A few months after arriving in Dallas, Oswald started writing letters to the Fair Play for Cuba Committee, which was a pro-Castro lobby group based in New York. He also wrote to the New York headquarters of America's Socialist Workers' Party and applied to become a party member. The party's national secretary wrote back, telling Oswald that the party had no branch in Texas, which meant that he couldn't be granted a formal membership. On the other hand, the secretary did invite Oswald to take out a paid subscription to the party's weekly newspaper, which was called The Militant. "I'm taking the liberty," he wrote, "of enclosing a number of subscription blanks to The Militant so that you can take full advantage of our introductory offer of 4 months for only $1. He didn't finish that sentence with an exclamation mark, but somehow it feels like it should have one. Anyway, Oswald seized on this generous introductory offer, and he took out a subscription to The Militant. This made 2 radical newspapers that Oswald now subscribed to. He already had a subscription to The Worker, which was a totally different kind of paper. The Worker was the official organ of the US Communist Party, and its line was strictly pro-Moscow. The Militant, on the other hand, was a Trotskyist paper which was critical of Moscow and sympathetic to Castro. The Militant got Oswald's attention for another reason too. It often ran articles deploring the right-wing bigotry of Dallas's own General Edwin Walker. In October 1962, Oswald landed a job at a Dallas printing firm. He wrote to the editors of both The Militant and The Worker to offer them his services as a freelance printer. He enclosed a few mock advertisements and blow-up posters to show off his skills. In December, both editors wrote back to Oswald and politely blew off his advances. Both papers were printed in New York, and neither of them had much use for a technical assistant based in Dallas. "Your kind offer is most welcomed, and from time to time we shall call on you," wrote the general manager of The Worker. Opinions vary as to whether Oswald was encouraged or bummed out by these non-committal replies from New York. Did he still think that he was going places as a left-wing mover and shaker? Or could he see that the lefty gatekeepers had absolutely no use for him, even when he offered them his services for free? Exactly how deluded was he, in other words? This will always be the big question about Oswald, and we'll never fully know the answer to it because we'll never be able to get all the way into his head. But although we'll never be sure of what Oswald was thinking at this point, we can be sure of what he did. In January 1963, just a month after failing to get any joy from the editors of The Worker and The Militant, Oswald mail-ordered the $30 pistol that he planned to shoot General Walker with. What happened next, I covered in episode 1. Walker went off on a 5-week speaking tour before Oswald's pistol arrived, and while he was out of town, Oswald did further recon work on his house, as a result of which he ordered his high-powered Mannlicher Carcano rifle in early March. Oswald ordered both the pistol and the rifle using what would become his standard fake name, A.J. Hidell. That's Fidel with an H instead of an F, although it should be said that Oswald didn't always spell Hidell the same way because he was dyslexic and his spelling was atrocious. Sometimes he spelt Hidell with one L on the end, sometimes with two. At work, he used the company's printing equipment to create some fake A.J. Hidell ID cards, which he would be needing when the time came to collect his guns at the post office. At one point, Oswald asked Marina to sign Hidell's name on a form so that the handwriting of the imaginary A.J. Hidell wouldn't match Oswald's own. Marina twigged straight away that Oswald's fake name was a tribute to his hero Fidel.
Did he agree that it was a variation on the name Fidel?
Well, he kind of just had a smile on his,
Well, he kind of had a smile on his face, Marina says there. So if we need any more clues about Oswald's motives as an assassin, here's another one. The guns he bought to shoot General Walker with, and ultimately shot Kennedy and Tippit with, were both ordered using an alias that paid homage to Fidel Castro. You could hardly ask for a neater illustration of what Oswald's crimes meant to him, and of how deeply his taste for homicide was mixed up with his mania for revolutionary politics. In late March and early April of 1963, things began to happen very fast in Oswald's life, and there are some important dates in this part of the story that we need to zero in on. Walker was due back from his speaking tour in the second week of April. On Monday, March the 25th, Oswald was notified that the packages he was waiting for, the rifle and the pistol, had both arrived at the post office. It's not known exactly when he picked them up, but he certainly did so at some point during that week. On March the 29th, which was a Friday, Oswald got some disastrous news at work. His boss took him aside and told him that he was being let go. His firing wasn't effective immediately. Oswald was given a week's notice. He responded to this setback the way he always responded to setbacks, with a flurry of hard-left activism. The day after he got the news, Oswald staged a one-man pro-Castro demonstration in downtown Dallas. A day after that, he poured his heart out in a letter to the headquarters of the Fair Play for Cuba Committee. "I do not like to ask for something for nothing, but I am unemployed," he wrote. "Since I am unemployed, I stood yesterday for the first time in my life with a placard around my neck, passing out Fair Play for Cuba pamphlets, etc. I only had 15 or so. In 40 minutes they were all gone. I was cursed as well as praised by some." Since he was now fresh out of propaganda material, Oswald asked the committee to send him, quote, 40 or 50 more of the fine basic pamphlets. The same day he wrote that letter, Sunday, March the 31st, 1963, Oswald asked Marina to take some interesting photos of him in the backyard of their apartment. You can look at these photos by Googling the phrase Oswald backyard photographs. They show a grim-faced Oswald dressed all in black. His brand new pistol is tucked into a holster on his hip. He's brandishing his equally brand new rifle in one hand, and in the other he's holding a copy each of The Worker and The Militant. The photos were taken on the Sunday morning. Oswald made sure that his neighbours had gone off to church before he ventured out into the yard with his guns and his subversive newspapers. He instructed Marina to take multiple snaps. She would recall taking at least 3 separate shots and perhaps as many as 6. And 3 distinct photographs from that session are known to exist, which show Oswald striking 3 slightly different poses. In one of them, Oswald's holding the rifle in his right hand and the radical newspapers in his left. In the remaining 2 photos, it's the other way around. In one of these, he's holding the papers and rifle at around navel height. In the other, he's holding them up at the level of his shoulders. So why was Oswald in such a rush to get these photos taken? For one thing, he knew that he'd be losing his job at the printing plant at the end of the coming week, and these weren't the kind of photos that he could let someone else develop. He had to develop them himself while he still had access to the darkroom at work. A different kind of man might have used his darkroom privileges to develop another kind of improper photo, but Oswald's idea of fun revolved exclusively around guns and left-wing newspapers. In any case, he didn't want these photographs to stay private for very long. When Marina asked him what they were for, he said they were, quote, for posterity. He told Marina that he wanted their daughter June to have one to, quote, remember Papa by sometime. When Marina asked why their daughter would want to remember her father as a man who liked posing with firearms in his backyard, Oswald had no answer. But in hindsight, we can see what he was up to. He wanted to lay down some kind of visual record of his motives before he took his shot at Walker. He had no idea if he would be captured or even killed while committing that crime, and if he was, he wanted to make sure that the deed would be understood as the act of a heroic and progressive man. After he developed the prints, he seemed delighted with the results. As promised, he presented one of them to his 1-year-old daughter. For Junie from Papa, he wrote on the back of it. He also showed one of the photos to Michael Paine, who was Ruth Paine's estranged husband. Many years later, the author Gus Russo asked Michael Paine why he thought Oswald had shown him the picture, and he said it, quote, represented an icon of just the way he'd like to be seen, the world to think of him the way he thought of himself. Oswald also gave an inscribed print to his friend George de Mohrenschildt. To my friend George from Lee Oswald, he wrote on the back of it. The inscription was dated April the 5th, 1963, which was 5 days before Oswald made his attempt on the life of General Walker. Underneath Oswald's inscription, there was a second inscription written in Russian, which had apparently been added by Marina. It said, Hunter of Fascists, ha ha ha, with 3 exclamation marks. As usual, Marina's satire was right on the money. Clearly this is exactly how Oswald saw himself at this point, as a hunter of fascists. He told Marina that he intended to send one of the photos to the editors of The Militant to prove that he was, quote, ready for anything. It sounds like one of Oswald's lies, but as it happened, he really did send one of the photos to The Militant's office. The receptionist who opened the envelope thought the photo made Oswald look, quote, kooky. She found it odd that Oswald had chosen to be photographed holding a copy of both The Militant and The Worker, given that those papers were published by rival factions of the left who absolutely hated each other. The receptionist thought that this aspect of the photo made Oswald seem, quote, really dumb and totally naive. She showed the photo to her boss, who was the National Secretary of the Socialist Workers' Party. He told her to let him know immediately if Oswald sent them any more stuff like that. The photo alarmed him. It was so far out there that he feared Oswald must be some kind of agent provocateur working for the government. As it happens, that same theory is very popular among conspiracy theorists. According to them, no true left-winger would have made the rookie error of allowing himself to be photographed while holding copies of both The Militant and The Worker. Hence, Oswald must have been some kind of secret agent posing as a left-winger. But when you think about it, the idea that Oswald was some kind of fake leftist is at least one step less plausible than the proposition that he was a true believer. If Oswald was a fake left-winger being run by the CIA or the FBI in an incredibly elaborate attempt to frame the left for Kennedy's murder, then why on earth would the CIA or the FBI have made the dumb mistake of letting Oswald pose with both The Militant and The Worker? When you look closely at the arguments of the conspiracy theorists, you always find big logical holes like this at the bottom of them. The conspiracists can't bring themselves to believe that Kennedy was assassinated by a slapdash and half-assed lone assassin, but somehow they can believe that he was murdered by a slapdash and half-assed conspiracy. The architects of this conspiracy had a chance to pick their fall guy from all the possible fall guys in America, and yet for some reason they decided to go with a hot-headed and unreliable outsider leftist from Dallas. Oswald was in some ways an improbable assassin. That much is certainly true, but the idea that some rational agency consciously chose this improbable figure to be their frontman or patsy will always be more improbable by definition. There's a slightly different conspiracy theory which has it that the backyard photographs were faked in a lab, and that Oswald never posed for any such photographs at all. This claim has been a staple of conspiracy theory for decades. In fact, it goes all the way back to the night after the assassination, when Lee Harvey Oswald tried it on himself. On the afternoon of Saturday the 23rd of November, detectives were searching Ruth Payne's garage when they found 2 of the backyard photographs among Oswald's personal effects. That evening, Captain Fritz was interrogating Oswald for the 4th or 5th time, and he whipped out one of these photographs to refute Oswald's claim that he didn't own a rifle. Oswald calmly replied that the photograph wasn't real. "Someone has taken a picture of my face and put it on a different body," he said. He explained that he'd worked in a photo lab himself, so he knew how easy it was to manipulate photographic images. More boldly still, Oswald told Captain Fritz that he'd never even lived in the apartment in Neely Street, Dallas, where the backyard photograph had been taken. That last claim was a desperate lie. In fact, Oswald had lived in that apartment for 2 months. His denial of this fact was so absurd that no conspiracy theorist I know of has ever bothered to defend him on this point. But it's amazing how many conspiracy theorists have been willing to defend Oswald's equally absurd claim that the backyard photographs were fakes. When the books of the earliest Kennedy conspiracy theorists were published, they made all sorts of attempts to prove that the angle of the shadow under Oswald's nose didn't match up with the angle of the shadow cast by his rifle, and so on. In Oliver Stone's JFK, there's a fanciful little montage that shows you how the backyard photographs were supposedly faked. You see a guy who isn't Oswald posing in a backyard with some guns and some radical newspapers. Then you see a mysterious hand pick up a scalpel and cut out the head from a genuine photograph of Oswald, and then paste that head onto the body of the gun-toting imposter in the backyard photo. Nowadays, there's no longer any serious argument about the authenticity of the backyard photographs. Computer analysis has proved beyond all doubt that they're genuine. But we didn't really need computers to tell us this. Right from the start, simple logic suggested that the backyard photographs had to be real. One of my favourite writers about the Kennedy case is a guy named John McAdams, who wrote a book called JFK Assassination Logic. McAdams had a little mantra that works as a repellent against most forms of conspiracy theory, and that mantra was, think scenario. What McAdams meant was, it's not enough to complain that this or that element of the official story strikes you as implausible. You've got to have the intellectual decency to think about the larger scenario that your complaints imply. For example, it's very easy for Oliver Stone to show us a mysterious hand faking the backyard photo of Oswald, but what is the larger scenario that Stone is signing himself up for? What else do you have to believe if you want to go around saying that some mysterious agency stuck a photo of Oswald's face onto a photo of somebody else's body? For a start, you have to believe that Marina Oswald was lying when she said that she took the backyard photographs. You also have to believe that all the people who said that Oswald showed them or sent them a copy of the photo before the assassination was lying too. On top of that, you have to believe that the same agency that fabricated the photographs also went to the trouble of forging Oswald's handwriting on the back of the surviving photo that he sent to George de Mohrenschildt, which seems like quite an unnecessary flourish. And speaking of unnecessary flourishes, don't forget that 3 distinct backyard photographs are known to exist, which show Oswald striking 3 slightly different poses. If somebody fabricated the backyard photographs, wasn't it a little bit redundant to fabricate 3 distinct but nearly identical images when one would have done the job just as well? In 1978, a panel of photographic experts appointed by the House Select Committee on Assassinations concluded that the backyard photographs were genuine. They wrote a long report which supported their conclusion with all sorts of technical analysis, but my favourite sentence in their whole report says, quote, "A fundamental question is whether a sophisticated conspirator would expose himself to unnecessary risks of detection by making 3 fake photographs when just 1 would suffice." It's an excellent point, but you don't need to be a photographic expert to think of it. You only need to have common sense. Unfortunately, common sense is the first faculty that people seem to check at the door when they decide to become conspiracy theorists. People like Oliver Stone spit in the face of common sense. And these are the same people who'll tell you that if you believe Oswald was the lone gunman, you must be incredibly naive and gullible and feeble-minded. You must be one of the sheeple. You must passively swallow everything that the American government tells you. I'd say if you can bring yourself to believe the backyard photographs were faked, your mind is so open that your brains have fallen out. There's another, even more basic question that people like Stone don't seem to ask themselves about the backyard photographs. If some agency like the CIA did go to the enormous trouble of fabricating 3 slightly different photos of Oswald and of forging Oswald's handwriting on at least one of them, then why on earth didn't they make the contents of the photo more incriminating? Because when you think about it, it's not as if the backyard photos deliver slam-dunk proof that Oswald murdered Kennedy. All he's doing in the photos is holding 2 guns and a couple of newspapers. It's not like he's holding up a map of the motorcade route and giving the thumbs up. It's not like he's aiming his rifle at a big picture of Kennedy's head. Yes, the backyard photographs are part of the mosaic of Oswald's guilt, but by themselves, they really don't prove very much at all. Which makes it quite interesting that Oswald himself felt the need to claim the photos were faked. Why did he do that when we know beyond doubt that they were real? I suppose the short answer is that he was guilty and he was lying about everything. But even though he was guilty, he didn't have to lie about the photographs. He could have said, "Yes, I posed for a photo with some newspapers and a couple of guns 8 months ago, but that doesn't prove that I killed the president. And he would have been right to say that. Instead, he made the provably false claim that he'd never even lived at the address where the photo was taken. Why did he feel compelled to tell this feeble lie? I think there might be a clue here that the backyard photographs do perhaps say more about Kennedy's murder than they superficially appear to. To understand why that might be, you need to look at the photos from Oswald's point of view. Remember, he'd been very keen to get them done before he took his shot at General Walker. As far as Oswald was concerned, the photos put his motives for the Walker shooting into a nutshell. In his mind, shooting at Walker was a logical and practical extension of the ideology contained in the pages of The Worker and The Militant. It doesn't matter that we can see that those papers had very different ideologies, and it doesn't matter whether we think that either of those ideologies gave Oswald a good reason to take a shot at a right-wing ex-general. What matters is that Oswald evidently thought that, and if that was the motive in Oswald's mind, then that was Oswald's motive. This is another point that I want to hammer here. It doesn't matter how silly or illogical we think Oswald's motive was. Whatever Oswald thought his motive was, that was Oswald's motive. His motive for what, though? Are we still talking about his motive for shooting at Walker, or have we started talking about his motive for killing Kennedy? By now, I think it should be clear that the motive for both crimes was essentially the same. This is why Oswald, now that he'd shot Kennedy, was going to such absurd lengths to pretend that the photo he'd posed for before shooting Walker was a fake. Because the photo that so eloquently summarized his motives for shooting at the general also summarized his motives for murdering the president. Oswald had to deny the backyard photograph was real because, in his mind, it did amount to slam-dunk proof that he'd killed the president. And more importantly, it revealed the secret of why he'd done it. What did JFK have in common with General Walker, though? On the face of it, not much at all. The two men came from opposite ends of the political spectrum. So what was it that connected them in Oswald's mind? One of the first serious attempts to answer that question came in an obscure book called The Assassination of President Kennedy, The Reasons Why, which was published in 1970 by a guy named Albert Newman. As Newman points out, Walker and Kennedy had absolutely nothing in common politically except for one little thing. They both wanted Fidel Castro out of Cuba. And for Oswald, Cuba was, of course, a very big thing. It was the main thing. In fact, it was pretty much the only theme that ran through his one-track mind between the Walker incident and November the 22nd. Cuba, Cuba, Cuba. Here again, it doesn't matter whether we think it made any sense for Oswald to take potshots at both a reactionary ex-general and a liberal president. And it doesn't matter if we can see that the murder of JFK was unlikely to impress Fidel Castro and certainly wasn't going to earn Oswald a permanent future in Cuba. If that was the motive that made sense in Oswald's mind, then that was Oswald's motive. He was a hunter of fascists. That's clearly what he considered himself to be on the night of April the 10th, when he took his shot at the head of General Walker. When Oswald slipped out of his apartment that night to do the deed, he left behind a pair of handwritten documents that cast even more light on what was going through his head at the time. One of them was a letter written in Russian, addressed to Marina. When Oswald still hadn't got home that night by 10 o'clock, Marina got worried. She opened the door of his study and she saw that Oswald had left this letter for her on his desk. The letter gave her instructions on what to do if Oswald didn't make it back from whatever it was he'd gone out to do. The letter didn't specify what that was, but it was clearly something very dangerous and illegal, because one of the things Oswald wrote was, quote, "If I am alive and taken prisoner, the The city jail is at the end of the bridge we always used to cross when we went to town. He also wrote, I left you as much money as I could, $60. You and June can live for another 2 months using $10 per week. This part of the letter should remind us that Oswald was also careful to leave Marina as much money as he could on the morning of November the 22nd, when he went out to take his shot at President Kennedy. Oswald's letter also instructed Marina to, quote, send the information as to what happened to me to the Russian embassy and include newspaper clippings should there be anything about me in the newspapers. I think the embassy will come quickly to your aid once they know everything. So Oswald apparently believed that if he knocked off Dallas's leading fascist and wound up dead or in jail, the Russians would be impressed enough to look after Marina and June. He also instructed Marina to, quote, either throw out my clothing or give it away. Do not keep it. However, I prefer that you hold on to my personal papers, military, civil, etc. Certain of my documents are in the small blue suitcase. One of the documents in the blue suitcase was a 2-page manifesto that Oswald had been laboriously composing for the past week or so as he impatiently waited for General Walker to get back to Dallas. The title Oswald gave to his manifesto was The Athenian System, although he misspelled the word Athenian by leaving out the first N. The Athenian System was Oswald's blueprint for the ideal society. In 2 pages worth of rough point-form notes, he outlined how the world, according to Lee Harvey Oswald, should be run. Oswald's efforts to describe the finer points of his Athenian system bring us back to the problem of Oswald and the written word. On the face of it, you'd think that if we want to know what made Oswald tick, all we need to do is read his blueprint for the ideal society. After all, this is the document that Oswald wanted the world to read if his plan to kill General Walker came off. Here, in his own words, was a rundown of the philosophy that had made Walker's murder so necessary. And again, it isn't much of a stretch to suppose that the same philosophy motivated his assassination of the president just 7 months later. So if we want to know what Oswald was thinking when he committed the crime of the century, his handwritten Walker manifesto ought to be a goldmine. But the Athenian system is a frustrating document. Far from being a goldmine, it's a mirage. It's fool's gold. The worst parts of it are flat-out gobbledygook. At best, it's just a vague laundry list of aspirations that don't seem all that original or pressing, and certainly don't seem urgent enough to justify political murder. The opening sentence informs us that the Athenian system is, quote, a system opposed to communism, socialism, and capitalism. A little further down we learn that Oswald is against violence, or was at least ready to say that he was, to make his manifesto sound suitably high-minded. We have no interest in violently opposing the US government, he writes. Why should we manifest opposition when there are far greater forces at work to bring about the fall of the United States government than we could ever possibly muster? In another part of the manifesto, Oswald declares himself opposed to the private ownership of rifles and pistols. He writes, quote, sale of arms. Pistols should not be sold in any case. Rifles only with police permission. Shotguns free. This was a bit rich coming from a man who didn't own a shotgun, but had just spent a good chunk of his family's annual income on both a rifle and a pistol. But here again, the basic insincerity of Oswald's writing shines through. Like a lot of the aspirations described in his manifesto, the stuff about guns seems completely arbitrary. It seems to have been plucked randomly from the air. You get the sense that Oswald badly wanted to be the kind of man who had deep principles and expressed them eloquently, but he just wasn't up to it. Partly the problem can be put down to Oswald's dyslexia. After Kennedy and Oswald were dead, a psychiatrist named Dr. Howard Rome was hired to do a posthumous psychological assessment of Oswald. I'll quote what Dr. Rome said about Oswald's dyslexia in a moment, but before I do, I want to acknowledge that my source for this quote and for a lot of the other material I've used so far in this podcast is Vincent Bugliosi's enormous book, Reclaiming History. Although I've acknowledged a lot of other writers by name so far, it's starting to bug me that I haven't yet mentioned Bugliosi, who is the author I've relied on more than any other. Bugliosi's Reclaiming History is by far the most comprehensive and useful book about the assassination ever written. It's 1,500 pages long, and it comes with a CD-ROM that contains 1,000 additional pages of endnotes. And this podcast would be far less substantial if I didn't have Bugliosi's book open beside me at all times. Anyway, as quoted by Bugliosi, here is what Dr. Rome wrote about Oswald's dyslexia. He wrote that dyslexia frequently results in, quote, a life experience marked by repeated thwarting in almost every field of endeavour. For a bright person to be handicapped in his use of language is an especially galling experience. It seems in Oswald's instance this frustration gave an added impetus to his need to prove to the world that he was an unrecognised great man. Martin Amis, in an essay written sometime later, took this line of thought a step further and argued that Oswald's inability to express himself verbally lay at the very root of his taste for violence. Inarticulacy is the key to Oswald's thwartedness, Amos wrote. He was a wife-beater, and what else is a wife-beater but a man who runs out of words, who keeps coming up empty on the words? I don't think Amos was wrong, although I think that his claim that Oswald kept coming up empty on the words needs to be tweaked. As we've seen, Oswald was actually quite a prolific wordsmith. He was actually quite full of words. It was the words themselves that were empty. This lack of intellectual content can hardly be blamed on his dyslexia. You can be dyslexic and still be a great thinker. Albert Einstein was dyslexic. Unfortunately, Oswald was no Einstein. The main word that comes to mind as you read his half-baked manifesto is the word perfunctory. He's phoning it in. You don't get the sense that he has any unique personal convictions that he urgently needs to convey to the world. You get the sense that he's heard somewhere that political killers are meant to have manifestos, so he's dutifully sat down to write one. But as he struggles to articulate his political beliefs, you realise that there just isn't that much there to articulate. The manifesto tells us that Oswald was against fascism, nationalism, and racial discrimination. But so what? Most good liberals at the time were against those things, and being against them doesn't sound like a sufficient reason to go around shooting people. Oswald also declares that he's against taxation of individuals, as well as weapons of mass destruction, which he thinks should be banned. As for the things he's supposedly in favour of, Oswald names free education, a free press, and universal suffrage. These last two things were strange inclusions, given Oswald's valorization of the Castro dictatorship in Cuba, but again this only underlines the point that Oswald's manifesto had no connection with what he really believed or with who he really was as a person. Not that I think he was being insincere on purpose. I'd say that the manifesto is an accurate reflection of how deeply confused Oswald was as a person. His motives for shooting Walker were probably unclear even to himself. He knew that he had this urge to murder men who were more powerful and prominent than he was, first Walker and ultimately Kennedy, and he knew that protocol demanded that he should have some sort of rational political motive for wanting to kill them. Otherwise he would just be a common criminal. But when he sat down to retrofit his homicidal urges with some kind of coherent political justification, he came up empty. Oswald's taste for violence wasn't a logical extension of his political beliefs. For him, the homicidal impulses came first, and the political justifications were afterthoughts. They were strictly secondary. Back at the start of this episode, I quoted that exasperated remark that Marina made to the House Select Committee on Assassinations in 1978. "The whole matter is so irrational," she said, "it is very hard for us to even come up with any rational answers." I think we can see now how right she was to say that. In Oswald's muddled manifesto, we see a man trying and failing to rationalise urges in himself that were simply not rational. But I hope that we've now acquired a deeper understanding of the nature of Oswald's irrationality. By the time he took his potshot at General Walker, Oswald's irrational politics had attached themselves almost exclusively to one destination, Cuba, and one person, Fidel. When the Walker attempt failed, Marina persuaded Oswald to relocate to New Orleans, where she hoped that both of them, especially Oswald, would be able to make a fresh start. But in New Orleans, Oswald's obsession with Cuba only intensified. The drumbeat in his head that said, "Cuba, Cuba, Cuba," kept getting louder and louder. The last clues to what Oswald did in Dallas lie in the 5 crucial months that he spent in New Orleans between April and September of 1963. And that's where we'll be going next time on The Ghosts of Dallas.
Then a number of stories come in. He was strongly pro-Castro. He was strongly anti-American. And he had been in correspondence, which we have, with this committee for fair play to Cuba. We have copies of the correspondence. So we've got him nailed down in his contact with them. None of those letters, however, dealt with any indication of violence or contemplated assassination.